Denise Halbrook extended her hand and told Mason Rourke to surrender half of his $14 tip. The single father refused. The guest had pressed the money into his palm after Mason spent 40 minutes searching a marina walkway and 3 luggage carts to recover a missing wedding ring. Denise tore his staff badge from the lanyard, called him selfish in front of the full lobby, and ordered security to escort him out. Mason had just placed his locker key on the counter when the glass door swung open. A woman in a dark coat stepped through. Every manager went pale. Evelyn Kingsley looked at Denise and said, "I'm the new owner, and I've heard enough. If honesty is worth more than a paycheck, stay, because $14 is about to bring down an entire system." Walter Briggs had arrived at Briarwood Harbor Hotel on a Tuesday afternoon carrying one soft-sided duffel bag and a grief he wore the way old men sometimes carry their best clothes, neatly but with an unmistakable weight. He was 70 years old, a retired carpenter from inland New Hampshire, and he had booked room 114 not for the ocean view, but because his wife Margaret had always wanted to return to this stretch of Maine coast before she passed, and he was finally making the trip for both of them. Mason Rourke had carried his bag from the shuttle to the lobby without being asked, noticed the man wincing each time he bent forward, and guided him to the elevator before reassigning any remaining porter requests to a younger colleague. That was the kind of service nobody recorded in a performance review, but Walter had taken notice. 2 mornings later, Walter stopped Mason in the corridor outside the sea-facing lounge and explained in a voice that barely held together that he could not find his wedding ring. A plain gold band he had removed the previous evening to wash his hands and somehow misplaced during a short walk down to the marina dock. Mason asked him to sit, took a description of the route, and spent the next 43 minutes retracing every step Walter described. The gravel marina path, the dock railing, the gift shop entrance, the shuttle vehicle, 2 unchecked luggage carts, and finally the narrow lining pocket inside Walter's own travel bag, where the ring had slipped through a torn interior seam and settled against a folded receipt. Walter held the ring in both hands for a full minute without speaking, and when he looked up, his eyes were red in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment. He pulled a $20 bill from his shirt pocket and pressed it toward Mason's hand. Mason shook his head the first time and said it was part of the job, and Walter said that was precisely why he needed to make clear that this part was not. Mason had purchased a small cedar ornament for Walter earlier that same morning, from the gift counter, at a cost of $6, covering it from his own pocket rather than send the man back across the lobby while his knee was bothering him. Walter told him to keep the $14 remaining and said something short about a man who does more than expected, deserving more than a nod. Mason accepted the bill with enough sincerity that Walter believed it, said, "Thank you," and walked toward the service corridor. Denise Halbrook had been standing 8 feet away during the exchange, watching from the moment Walter reached into his shirt pocket, and by the time Mason turned toward the hallway, she was already moving toward him with the deliberate stride she used when she wanted someone to feel cornered before the conversation began. She said the words quickly, and in a register low enough to suggest she's considered this a private correction. "Half of that goes to the pool. You know the arrangement." Mason told her the guest had given it directly to him for a service outside his standard duties, which, under the employee handbook, defined the gratuity as personal rather than pooled. Denise told him he was not the one who got to define the arrangement. He asked her to show him the written policy that required him to divide a direct cash gratuity with management. She told him to stop making a scene. He had not raised his voice once. Within 6 minutes, Denise Halbrook had gathered a front desk associate, a duty supervisor, and a room service runner as witnesses, called the exchange a formal incident of insubordination, and declared Mason Rourke's employment terminated effective immediately for refusal to comply with management directive, disruption of team operations, and inappropriate retention of pooled gratuity funds. Jonah Bell, 55 years old and 18 years into his tenure at the hotel, stood near the hallway entrance and looked at the floor when Mason glanced toward him. Not out of indifference, but because Jonah had stood in exactly this position before and knew what happened to the people who made noise. Piper Langley, the assistant front desk manager, had stopped at the printer station and was holding a folder she had not opened since Denise began speaking. The lobby had not gone completely silent, but the guests closest to the desk had slowed their conversations. Walter Briggs had not yet left the lounge corridor and was close enough to hear Denise's final declaration, that Mason was to surrender his locker key, clear his personal items, and be escorted from the building. Mason set the key on the counter with a deliberateness that made clear it was not a surrender but a conclusion. He had started to step toward the side door when the main entrance opened and the morning light shifted. The woman who walked in did not announce herself, did not look around with the uncertain expression of a new arrival or pause to let a doorman carry anything, because she had no luggage and she had already studied the floor plan. She wore a dark linen coat and low heels, and she moved through the lobby with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned that entering a room unannounced was often the most accurate way to see it. Evelyn Kingsley was 36 years old, the founder of Kingsley Crown Hospitality Group, and she had completed the private acquisition of Briarwood Harbor Hotel for $68 million through a holding structure designed to close without alerting the property's current staff or management until the final paperwork was signed. The transfer was not scheduled to be announced until the following morning, and Denise Halbrook had known for 2 weeks only that a new ownership group was preparing to complete a purchase. Not who they were, not when they would arrive, not that the person now standing at the edge of her lobby had been reading detailed internal reports for 14 days. Evelyn set a document folder on the front desk, looked at the termination scene still unresolved in the center of the room, and spoke to Denise with the kind of calm that is distinctly more difficult to argue against than anger. She said, "From this morning, this property belongs to me. Nothing that was just announced stands until I say otherwise." Denise Halbrook recovered faster than most people would have. She smoothed the front of her blazer, introduced herself by title, and offered a prepared welcome that she had clearly rehearsed for this moment, though she had imagined it happening in a conference room with coffee, not in the middle of a staff termination in front of a retired carpenter and a room service runner. Evelyn accepted none of the framing. She introduced Rebecca Sloan, who stood slightly behind her and to the left, as her general counsel, and said that before any courtesy exchange took place, she needed 3 things: the existing staff file on the employee who had just been dismissed, the hotel's official written policy on gratuity distribution, and access to the most recent 12 months of payroll records. Denise said the timing was irregular and that she would be happy to arrange a briefing with relevant department heads. Evelyn said she had not asked for a briefing. There was a long pause, the kind that in any professional setting means one party has already decided the direction and is allowing the other to catch up without forcing them to lose face. Denise said she would need to involve the hotel's legal contact, and Rebecca said that was fine, and that in the meantime no personnel records were to leave the building, no digital access was to be modified, and no employment decisions made in the last 48 hours were to be executed until reviewed. Denise began to say that she had been managing this property for 9 years and understood its operations better than any document review could capture, and Evelyn let her finish before saying, "That is exactly what I'm here to understand." Mason had not moved toward the door. He stood with his locker key already surrendered, his jacket straightened, watching the exchange with an expression that communicated neither relief nor vindication, only the careful stillness of a man who had learned not to decide what an outcome meant until it was actually over. Evelyn turned to look at him directly and said his name, not as a question but as a confirmation, and asked him to stay. Denise interjected that Mason had been formally terminated for cause, and that protocol required him to leave the premises. Rebecca said the termination was suspended pending review, and that suspension was not a reinstatement, but it was also not an authorization for anyone to remove him from the building. Evelyn asked Mason quietly whether he still had the gratuity in question. He said he did. She said he should keep it where it was. Mason watched Denise process that instruction from the owner, who now legally controlled everything in the building, including the chair Denise was currently standing in front of, and he saw the moment she understood that the calculation she had made this morning was not the one that would determine the next hour. Evelyn then said something that shifted the temperature of the entire lobby. She told Mason she had read 6 anonymous reports submitted through the Acquisition Ethics portal over the past 2 weeks, that she had been expecting to meet him that morning, and that she had not expected to arrive while he was being removed from the building he had been trying to protect. 2 weeks earlier, Mason Rourke had found a notice in the staff break room, a 1-page form letter about the pending ownership transition, standard language about change of management, and no expected disruption to daily operations. And in the lower corner there was a web address for an ethics disclosure portal maintained by the acquiring company, with a note that anonymous submissions were accepted and reviewed prior to final closing. He had stared at the address for a long time before writing it down. He had not gone looking for it because he was trying to position himself for anything. He had gone looking because 3 days earlier, Jonah Bell had shown him a pay stub where the recorded tip income was $63 below what Jonah had actually received that week, and Mason had done the calculation of how many weeks Jonah had been working at this hotel and how many of those weeks the discrepancy might have appeared. He submitted his first report that same evening from the public library 2 miles from the hotel, and he wrote it carefully. No accusations without specifics, no generalizations without dates, no names except where the name was directly attached to the transaction. Over the following 13 days, he submitted 5 more, each focused on a separate practice he had either witnessed directly or heard described with enough corroborating detail to include a table of tip amounts guests had disclosed to him versus amounts that appeared on staff earnings summaries, the names of 2 employees whose hours had been reduced within a week of filing internal complaints, the names of 3 former employees whose tax identification numbers still appeared on payroll disbursement records as active recipients, and a documented instance of Denise Halbrook requesting that a housekeeper hand over $12 in direct gratuity before the end of a shift. Mason had not known whether anyone was reading the submissions. He had received no confirmation response, and after the 3rd report he had considered stopping because Jonah told him that Jonah himself had tried filing a complaint through the hotel's internal HR channel 2 years earlier and had seen his weekend shifts reduced to 1 for the following month without any written explanation. The reason Mason kept going was not confidence that it would work, but the specific discomfort of knowing the information existed and choosing not to write it down. He had a daughter in community college who needed him employed. He carried medical debt from his wife's final 18 months that he was still paying in installments. And he had no financial reserve that would absorb more than a few weeks of job loss. Yet every time he calculated the cost of continuing, he returned to Jonah's notebook, which he had only partially seen, and to the number of years it represented. Evelyn told him, standing in the lobby of the hotel he had come to view as a place where the system was too embedded to fight, that every report had been read, that each had been forwarded to an independent review team, and that the reason the investigation had not yet produced an intervention was that the legal standard for pre-closing action required documentation that the ethics portal alone could not satisfy without corroborating internal records. She said she had arrived a day early specifically to speak with him before the formal announcement, and before anyone in management had time to prepare for her questions. She had not expected that Denise would provide the opportunity so efficiently. Rebecca Sloan had already opened her laptop on a side credenza near the concierge desk, and she spoke without looking up when she told Evelyn that all 6 of Mason's reports had been logged into the acquisition system, that each had been forwarded to Lawrence Pemberton's compliance officer as required under the pre-closing due diligence protocol, and that each had been marked as reviewed and resolved with no action required. All 6, on the same day, within the same 2-hour window, from the same user access credential. Rebecca requested the official gratuity policy from the hotel's employee relations binder, which Piper Langley retrieved from the back office with both hands and set on the desk without meeting anyone's eyes. The policy was clear on 4 points that had not changed in the document's last revision. Direct cash gratuities passed personally from a guest to an employee were the exclusive property of the receiving employee. Management personnel were explicitly prohibited from collecting, pooling, or redistributing direct cash gratuities without the employee's written voluntary consent. Only service charges billed to group events and added automatically to a guest's account were eligible for pool distribution through payroll, and those distributions required itemized reporting. And any disciplinary action related to a gratuity dispute required written documentation, a supervisor review, and a 48-hour response period before becoming final. Denise did not contest any of these 4 points. Instead, she produced a laminated card from the front pocket of her blazer, a document she described as the internal operational supplement for guest services staff, which she said clarified the policy for cash transactions in the hotel's specific revenue structure. Rebecca took the document, examined both sides, and said 3 things. The supplement carried no ownership signature, no issue date, and no document control number that would allow it to be located in the hotel's official records system. She passed it to Evelyn. Evelyn looked at it briefly and set it face down on the desk. Walter Briggs had come into the lobby from the corridor while Denise was describing the supplement, and he stood near the entrance to the seating area with his duffel bag over one shoulder, listening. When there was a pause, he said he was the guest who had given the money, that he had specifically handed it to Mason as a personal expression of gratitude, and that he had not offered it with any expectation that it would be divided with anyone who had not been present during the search. No one had asked him to say this. He said it with the matter-of-fact simplicity of a man who had spent decades doing work where things were either built right or they were not. The lobby camera had already recorded the exchange, which Rebecca confirmed by pulling 40 seconds of footage on a tablet her team had accessed remotely within the first 15 minutes of their arrival. The footage showed Walter pressing the bill into Mason's hand, Mason initially declining, and Walter insisting with words the audio track captured clearly. Piper Langley had slipped away from the front desk and had not been seen for several minutes when she returned carrying a single sheet of paper, which she set on the counter and then stepped back from as though she needed distance from what it said. The termination notice for Mason Rourke had been printed that morning. The document's creation timestamp, visible in the file metadata Rebecca pulled immediately, showed it had been generated 2 hours and 17 minutes before Walter Briggs had gone to look for his wedding ring. Evelyn looked at Denise for a long moment before she spoke, her voice level. If $14 was only the reason you used, what was the reason you actually had? The answer to that question had been building for 6 weeks, and Mason Rourke had felt it in the specific way that people who work in service environments feel the approach of consequences they did not cause. Not like a coming confrontation, but like a slow narrowing of space. He had started asking questions about the tip pool distribution in late autumn, first quietly and through informal channels. Why the weekly pool summary did not include individual line items. Why a colleague's reported cash receipts were consistently lower than the amounts that colleague described receiving. Why Jonah Bell, who had been with the hotel for nearly 2 decades, was scheduled for only 2 shifts in a week when the banquet calendar showed 5 booked events. The questions were not aggressive, and Mason had not framed them as accusations. He framed them the way someone does when they believe there is probably a reasonable explanation and they want to hear it, as requests for clarification. Denise had responded to the first 3 with administrative deflection. Summaries were structured for efficiency, discrepancies were rounding adjustments, scheduling was managed to operational need, and to the 4th with something else. A direct look held a beat longer than a routine correction requires, followed by a reassignment that moved Mason from the shuttle and guest services rotation to a late-night luggage storage shift for the following 2 weeks. It was Jonah who explained to Mason what that reassignment meant. Jonah kept a small spiral notebook in his locker and had been keeping it for 3 years. Room numbers, dates, shift times, amounts guests handed him, amounts that appeared on his weekly earnings statement, and the difference between the two. He had not started the notebook because he believed it would ever be used for anything formal. He had started it the way cautious people begin keeping records when something feels wrong, and they cannot prove it yet, because the notebook meant the information would exist somewhere. Jonah told Mason that 2 years earlier he had walked into the HR office and shown a printed version of 6 weeks of his records to the department coordinator, and that within 5 days his weekend shifts had been reassigned and he had received a verbal counseling notice for attitude concerns. He had not filed the complaint again. He had kept the notebook. Denise had been watching Mason closely since the reassignment, and she had told Grant Whitaker in a message that Mason needed to be characterized as a disruptive element before the ownership transition created a window for him to escalate his questions to a new audience. Grant had replied that any risk-generating employee should be addressed cleanly and in advance of closing, and he had used the specific phrase that would later appear in the investigation summary, resolved before transition. The $14 had provided the occasion Denise needed. She had not manufactured the tip or staged the scene, but she had been waiting for exactly this type of moment. A small, documentable refusal she could convert into a formal termination before anyone with the authority to reverse it was in the building. Jonah Bell walked up to Mason, held out his spiral notebook with both hands, and said, 3 years. I think it's time someone else reads this. The notebook contained 41 weeks of records in Jonah's careful handwriting. Room numbers written in pencil, tip amounts circled, and a running second column Jonah had labeled received versus reported. The pattern was not subtle once the numbers were laid side by side. In 37 of the 41 weeks, the reported figure was lower than the received figure by amounts ranging from $12 to over $90, and the discrepancies were larger on the weeks when the hotel's banquet schedule had been full and the LABA traffic heavier, exactly the weeks when cash gratuities would have been most frequent and most difficult for any individual employee to track against a pooled summary. Rebecca's team cross-referenced the notebook against payroll records pulled from the primary system and found that several amounts Jonah had recorded as received had been entered into the hotel's books, not as labor income, but as a line item the CFO's office had classified as incidental service revenue, a category that did not flow to employee earnings and was instead absorbed into the property's general operating income. 3 names appeared as active payroll recipients on disbursement records during weeks when those individuals had already separated from the hotel's employment. 2 who had resigned voluntarily and 1 who had been terminated, all 3 of whose accounts were still receiving distributions described in the accounting as tip pool contributions, with 1 account having received such distributions for 11 months after the employee's separation date. The preliminary figure the external audit team produced by the end of that day was $214,000. The combined total of gratuity and service charge income over 3 years that could not be reconciled with the amounts actually credited to employee accounts. Evelyn had offered Mason a temporary paid suspension while the investigation proceeded, framed as standard protocol for anyone whose employment dispute had triggered a formal inquiry. Mason said he understood the protocol but preferred to remain in the building because the employees who had confided in him and provided the records supporting the investigation were still working their shifts in a hotel where Denise Halbrook, suspended from system access or not, was still physically present and still someone they answered to every working day. He asked what specific arrangement could be made that would allow him to stay. Rebecca told him he could not conduct any independent investigation, could not pressure any colleague to provide additional statements, and could not take any unilateral action on behalf of another employee. Evelyn looked at him for a moment and then said she was willing to designate him as a temporary employee liaison. Not an investigative role, not a supervisory role, but a formal channel through which other staff members could direct questions or concerns to the investigation team without having to approach management directly. Mason accepted. He asked whether Jonah Bell could be given the same formalized protection. Evelyn said yes without hesitation. The preliminary audit number would be revised upward twice over the following weeks. But the initial calculation was already significant enough that it changed the character of everything happening inside the hotel's main conference room, where Evelyn had moved the conversation after deciding that conducting a financial review in the lobby was not in anyone's best interest. On the second evening of the investigation, Evelyn found Mason standing on the service side of the kitchen loading dock, which connected to an exterior ledge overlooking the harbor inlet. She stood at the far end of the ledge without speaking for a minute before he acknowledged her presence, and she asked him why he had stayed at this hotel as long as he had. He said his daughter was in her first year of community college studying accounting, that he had carried a balance of medical debt for 3 years from his wife's illness, and that the Briarwood Harbor position had been the most stable work available within commuting range of where he and Hadley lived. He said there were people at the hotel who had been there longer than he had with less financial flexibility, and he had concluded early in his second year that leaving a broken system intact for the people remaining inside it was not a decision he could make simply to protect his own position. Evelyn said that was a more deliberate way of thinking about it than most people in his situation managed. Mason said he wasn't sure it was deliberate as much as it was the only way he knew how to sleep. He then asked her why she had purchased a $68 million property without knowing what was happening inside it, and he asked it without apology and without the softening most employees apply automatically when addressing someone who controls their livelihood. Evelyn was quiet for a moment before she answered. She said the property had a coastal position that had appreciated consistently for 12 years, a reputation for guest satisfaction that appeared strong in aggregated review data, and a financial model that Pemberton Coastal's team had presented, showing stable operating margins and a workforce with low turnover by industry standards. She said her due diligence team had identified nothing in the disclosed records that warranted a delayed close, and she had trusted the structure of the acquisition process to surface what the seller was required to disclose. Mason said that the turnover rate she had been shown was almost certainly constructed from only the employees who had formally submitted resignation notices, and that the majority of staff who had left in the past 2 years had been quietly cycled out through shift reduction rather than termination, which meant they did not show up in the disclosed numbers because they had not been fired and had not quit in any way the system was designed to record. He said that the way powerful people read employee silence as institutional stability was one of the most reliable features of a broken workplace. Evelyn did not argue with this. She said she had been wrong to trust the seller's summary without independent corroboration, and that she was saying it plainly rather than explaining it away. She said something more honest then, that she had not thought carefully enough about whether a hospitality asset with a clean balance sheet could carry debts that do not appear on any balance sheet. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Rebecca found them on the ledge 20 minutes later and reported that Piper Langley had come to her voluntarily and asked to provide a full statement. Piper Langley sat in the conference room with a glass of water she did not drink and described 18 months of requests she had processed without question because she had learned early in her tenure that questioning Denise was not something you did if you wanted to keep a schedule you could plan your life around. She had signed blank distribution authorization forms on multiple occasions when Denise told her it was a routine administrative consolidation, and that the amounts would be filled in by the payroll office. She had seen Grant Whitaker carry a stack of pay cards out of the accounting office on at least 3 occasions on dates that did not correspond to any standard payroll cycle she could identify. She knew that a front desk associate named Marcus had been taken off the weekend overnight shift 2 days after he raised a question at a staff meeting about how service charges were calculated, and she had said nothing. She had been handed the termination form for Mason Rourke and asked to hold it in the printer queue early that morning. And she had done it, and she said this, looking directly at Mason with the kind of honesty that does not ask for absolution, but does ask to be heard. Mason had been angry when Rebecca first told him the form had been pre-prepared, and sitting across from Piper the anger was still there, but it had been reorganized by the recognition that he had done his own version of the same thing, stayed quiet for months, recalibrated his questions to be less direct, chosen the timing of his reports carefully to minimize the risk of immediate retaliation, because the cost of speaking clearly is never evenly distributed between the person who holds the schedule and the person who appears on it. Evelyn told Piper she could not offer immunity from any administrative consequences the investigation determined were warranted, but that she could provide an independent attorney at no cost to Piper, and that the hotel's whistleblower policy, which Evelyn had already reissued in its corrected form as the property's new owner, protected any employee providing good faith cooperation. Piper provided email records, copies of distribution sheets bearing her signature alongside amounts she confirmed she had not verified, a list of pay card accounts she had seen Whitaker access, and a text message chain between herself and Denise that included a message sent 3 weeks earlier in which Denise had written, "Any employee who is creating exposure before the transition needs to be removed from the rotation cleanly." When Rebecca read the email chain Grant Whitaker had sent to the hotel's finance server over a period of 8 months, she stopped on one message sent 2 days before the scheduled closing announcement. Tip pool must remain below labor forecast before closing. That sentence confirmed what Mason had suspected from his first report, but had been careful not to assert without evidence. The gratuity figures reported to Pemberton's team and therefore to Kingsley Crown had been deliberately suppressed to make the labor cost structure appear more favorable than it was. The missing tips were not only theft, they were also the instrument used to manufacture a sale price. Lawrence Pemberton arrived at Briarwood Harbor Hotel on the third morning of the investigation driving himself, which told Evelyn something about the state of his composure. He was 63 years old, the founder of Pemberton Coastal Properties, and he had built a reputation over 4 decades for acquiring aging coastal properties and restoring them to profitability through a combination of brand repositioning and cost reduction. The latter of which, Evelyn now understood, included a labor cost structure that depended on employees not asking what happened to the money guests left for them. He walked into the conference room where Evelyn, Rebecca, and 2 members of the acquisition team were seated and told Evelyn that what she was doing was operationally reckless, that she had suspended the property's senior management during the busiest booking window of the quarter, that she had created a climate of uncertainty among staff that was difficult to reverse on short notice, and that by treating a routine employment dispute as a material investigation, she was potentially triggering disclosure obligations under the sale agreement that could expose both parties to liability. Evelyn let him finish. She then asked him about the 6 reports that had been submitted through the acquisition ethics portal and marked as reviewed and resolved on the same day, from the same credential, within the same 2-hour window. Lawrence said he had not personally reviewed those submissions and had delegated disclosure assessment to his compliance team. Rebecca pointed out that the credential attached to the resolution entries was Lawrence's own. Mason had been asked to wait outside the conference room and had done so, but he was present in the corridor when Lawrence emerged 30 minutes later, and their eyes met briefly. Mason did not speak. Lawrence looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has just learned that the specific person they hoped was not at the center of this situation is, in fact, at its center. Lawrence said, to no one in particular, that none of this had been his intention. Mason said he understood. Then he said, the reports were marked resolved. Can you tell me what was resolved? Lawrence did not answer. He called his personal attorney from the lobby and left the building. When Rebecca's team pulled the hotel's off-site backup server, a data storage arrangement contracted to a third-party facility in Portland, they found the information Grant Whitaker had apparently believed was inaccessible or forgotten, copies of the weekly tip pool summaries Denise had sent to accounting, Grant's instructions on which portions to reclassify as service revenue, Lawrence's summary reports aggregating the adjusted figures, and a folder of documents related to the acquisition disclosure package in which the line recording employee-directed gratuity income had been reduced to less than half of what the actual figures showed. Late that evening, Grant Whitaker sent Lawrence Pemberton a text message captured by the document preservation order already in place on all hotel communications infrastructure. It read, "If they open the backup server, we're both finished." The full staff meeting was held in the hotel's main ballroom on the 4th day, and Evelyn Kingsley opened it by standing at the front of the room without a podium or any visible notes, and saying that she owed every person present a clear explanation of what had happened, what had been found, and what was going to happen next. She said what was true, that the investigation had confirmed a systematic practice of gratuity suppression and payroll manipulation that had operated for at least 3 years, that the preliminary unreconciled total was $214,000, and that this figure was expected to rise as the full audit proceeded. She said that no employee who had provided information to the investigation team would face retaliation, and that any employee who had been included in a distribution sheet, payroll record, or scheduling action they had not authorized should come forward regardless of how small the amount seemed. Denise Halbrook stood near the side wall, with the containment of someone who has decided that appearing composed is the only remaining form of control available to her. And when Evelyn presented the pre-dated termination document, she said that Mason had been building a case against her for weeks, and that the entire situation was a coordinated effort to discredit management ahead of a transition that would have proceeded without incident if he had simply been removed earlier. Walter Briggs had come back to the hotel specifically for this meeting, having called the front desk the previous evening to ask quietly whether he was permitted to attend. Mason stood up from the middle of the room and spoke for approximately 2 minutes. He said he had not attended the meeting to see Denise humiliated, and he said this because he meant it, because he had been humiliated in this same building 4 days earlier, in front of Walter and Jonah and Piper and 2 guests who had been checking in at the time. And he had not forgotten what that felt like and did not want to be the instrument of it happening to someone else, regardless of what that person had done. He said he wanted a system in which no individual manager had unchecked authority over another person's income, schedule, and employment status. Not because Denise was uniquely bad, but because the system that allowed her to operate as she had would produce the same outcome with any person who occupied that role without oversight. He said the goal was not punishment, but a structure that made certain abuses difficult to commit because the opportunity for them no longer existed unobserved. The room was quiet when he finished, not the quiet of people unsure how to respond, but the quiet of people who recognized something accurate. Rebecca Sloan then stated the outcomes. Denise Halbrook's employment was terminated effective immediately pending referral to the Maine Department of Labor for investigation. Grant Whitaker's employment was terminated for cause and referred to financial regulatory authorities. Lawrence Pemberton was subject to a clawback of his transition bonus under the acquisition contract's non-disclosure warranty provisions and named as a party to the Labor Board complaint. Piper Langley was placed on a temporary supervisory suspension with a defined reinstatement pathway and a restitution fund of $300,000, accounting for the preliminary audit findings, plus a buffer for claims not yet documented, was established as an immediate obligation of the transition agreement, with disbursement managed by an independent administrator and available to any current or former employee who could document a gratuity or service charge discrepancy. Mason Rourke did not become the hotel's general manager. He did not have the operational background for the role, said this himself when Evelyn raised the possibility the week after the staff meeting, and said it without embarrassment or false modesty. Just the straightforward assessment of a person who knows the shape of the job he can do well. What she offered him instead was a role she had not offered anyone before, Director of Employee and Guest Experience, a position she described as a connector function rather than an authority function. He would review the tip and service charge system on a rolling quarterly basis, sit in on the first review meeting whenever a new manager was hired, receive every formal complaint submitted through any internal channel before it was routed to department leadership, and report directly to Evelyn or her designated operations lead. He would not have hiring or firing authority, but he would have the specific authority to escalate any payroll discrepancy, scheduling change, or disciplinary action to an external review body if the internal process was not completed within a defined window. The system Evelyn implemented at Briarwood Harbor over the following 3 months included direct cash gratuities recorded in a receipt log confirmed by both the receiving employee and one witness, service charges itemized as a distinct line on every employee's earnings statement with the calculation method visible, a digital tip pool transparency dashboard available to every staff member, a prohibition on managers handling cash gratuities at any point in the transaction. a two-supervisor approval requirement for any disciplinary action involving employment change, and an anonymous external reporting line routed to a third-party ethics organization rather than to the hotel's internal HR function. Jonah Bell was asked to join the newly formed Employee Advisory Council and said yes before Evelyn finished the sentence. Hadley Rourke spent 4 weeks during her semester break, completing a financial records review internship with the audit team, arranged through Evelyn's office and subject to the same competitive selection process as any other applicant, a condition Mason had stated explicitly before Hadley submitted her application. Evelyn remained at the property through the full transition period, and she and Mason disagreed regularly. She moved toward speed and he moved toward trust. She held the wide view, and he kept returning to the people the wide view made easy to miss. He told her once that the most dangerous thing about a well-designed system was that it made the people running it feel they had already done the ethical work. She told him the most dangerous thing about working from the ground up was believing that the people at the top could only ever be obstacles. They were both partially right, which meant neither of them was right enough to stop listening to the other. One afternoon, she told him she had bought the hotel for its location. He said if she wanted to keep it, she was going to have to learn the names of the people who made it function. The next morning, she started taking her lunch in the staff break room rather than the private dining suite, and she did it without announcing it as a gesture, which was how Mason knew it was real. Walter Briggs came back to Briarwood Harbor Hotel exactly 1 year after the afternoon he had sat in the lounge corridor with a recovered wedding ring in his hands and watched a man in a staff uniform accept $14 with more dignity than most people bring to a much larger transaction. He arrived on a clear late summer afternoon, drove his own truck into the parking lot, and carried a small paper bag into the lobby without checking in because he was not staying overnight. He asked for Mason Rourke at the front desk, and the young woman who answered knew exactly who he meant. Mason came down from the second floor, where he had been meeting with a new banquet supervisor, and found Walter standing near the fireplace alcove that the renovation had opened to a harbor window. Walter took a small frame from the bag. Inside it were 2 bills, one 10 and one 4, $14 arranged flat, the actual bills he had kept since the day Mason had returned his ring, not a copy or a replica. Walter said he thought Mason should have them somewhere he could see them, in a place that reminded him that some amounts are too small to argue about and too significant to forget. Mason walked Walter through the side hallway to the staff lounge, the room the renovation had expanded and where the new Employee Advisory Board held its monthly meetings, and found an empty space on the wall between the announcement board and the window facing the parking lot. Beneath the frame he attached a small card. It read, "A tip belongs to the person whose service inspired it. Respect belongs to everyone." The anniversary gathering Evelyn organized was held in the same ballroom where the accountability meeting had taken place, and she had made one decision that every staff member noticed. There was no designated area for leadership, the seating was open, and the buffet ran along one wall the way it did at every other event the hotel hosted. She spoke briefly without a prepared text and thanked people by name, Jonah, for keeping a record when keeping a record was an act of private resistance with no guaranteed audience. Piper, for choosing truth after choosing silence, because the second choice is sometimes harder than the first. Walter, for coming back when he was not required to, because witnesses who return voluntarily are the ones who make accountability real. Rebecca, for treating the process as something that needed to be right rather than just fast. And the 43 current and former employees who had submitted documentation to the restitution fund, each of whom had trusted that this time someone would read what they sent. She did not describe Mason as the person who had saved the hotel. She described him As the person who had sent 6 reports into a system, he had no confirmation was working, and had kept sending them, which was a different kind of courage than the kind that requires a visible audience. After the gathering, Mason and Evelyn stood on the refurbished harbor terrace in the long light of a late summer evening, and she asked him whether he had ever regretted holding on to the $14. He said yes, for about 4 minutes, standing at the counter with his locker key in his hand, thinking about Hadley's spring semester tuition payment. But if he had given the money to Denise, he said, he would have had to give it to her again the next day and the day after that, and eventually there is no version of that transaction that ends with him being the person he needs his daughter to think he is. Evelyn looked at the water and said she had spent years believing that power meant walking into a room and making people stop what they were doing. Mason said that was one kind. She asked what kind he thought was better. He said, the kind where people don't have to stop what they are doing and wait to see how you want them to feel. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had no further business to discuss, no legal documents pending, and asked if he was free for dinner. He said he was, on one condition. She asked what it was. He said she had to let him leave the full tip for whoever waited on them, and she had to promise not to ask anyone to give any part of it back. She said that was not a condition. That was just how things worked now. They went inside through the main entrance. The same glass door she had walked through on the morning everything changed. And behind them, the harbor light went flat and golden and still. The same color it had been on the afternoon a 70-year-old man with a recovered wedding ring had pressed $14 into a bellman's palm and said, simply, that a man who does more than expected deserves more than a nod.